Hello, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I'm Aparna from IIT Bombay, and I am going to talk to you on module on digital urbanism and smart city. This comes under paper of Sociology of Urban Transformation. After listening to this lecture, we'll be able to gain an insight on the idea of middle class and how the class has emerged in India during the colonial times and what are the new dimensions around which this idea of middle class has grown and developed. The module will also assist in locating middle class in the writings of very few important social theorists and how their ideas of class have influenced our understanding of middle class. The module delineates characteristic features of middle class and discuss differentiations within middle class. And at the end, we'll also discuss the idea of aspiration, how middle class aspiration influences politics, economy, and culture in post-liberalization era. We often hear people refer themselves common man, Aam Aadmi, or as Madhyam Vargiya. What do these terms indicate? And all these varied vernacular, popular and regional terms are synonymous with what we call middle class in social sciences. Middle class as a term and as a social category is so widespread that academicians, politicians, media houses, activists, and people in general, they use it in everyday conversation without any special aid. So it seems we have inherited this idea, we have believed in its pre-givenness and accept these terms as self-explanatory. So, what is the location of this social category in the social structure? In commonsensical notion, middle class means an average category whose members are in between. So that is, they are neither rich nor poor, neither orthodox nor liberal, neither traditional nor modern. They are now not owners of industries and factories, but they are better off than poor, and they are those who live in below the poverty line. They are better off than those who live below the poverty line. So therefore, middle class is a social category whose members do not have enough resources to live extravagant, lavish lives, but and do not live hand to mouth as well. In a sense, it is a residual category, or the left outs who are excluded from both rich and the poor. We hear a lot that bureaucrat locates itself in middle class category, but we also come across people who own grocery shops, they involve in petty business, and they also refer and locate themselves in middle class. In commonsensical definition and classification, people with varied socioeconomic positions, preferences, lifestyles are considered to comprise a uniform and homogeneous category. However, lifestyles, possession of consumer durables, taste, aspirations, and accessibilities to different amenities, as well as income of these people, varies a lot. So therefore, to make our job simpler, we'll classify and divide this differentiated and heterogeneous group as upper middle class, middle class, lower middle class. We can also ask what is and who are middle class? Is the idea as well as this category of middle class in India a myth? And are parameters that are used by non-specialists sufficient to explain middle class? Is household income a sufficient variable to understand this class? And is its activism, its preferences, lifestyle capable enough to understand it? So when middle class itself is a heterogeneous category, then what commonalities do the members share? This module, away from common sense ideas and categorization of middle class, draws attention towards academic discussions about middle class. First, the module locates middle class in the theories of class. Economic determination, estimation, and discussion often fails to forward adequate explanation of the role of middle class in capitalist economies. A cultural approach also has been found inadequate in understanding middle class, and that how culture practices trigger self-presentation and self-cultivating among the middle class. Therefore, the module focus on cultural practices and class reproduction and draws attention towards colonial, post-colonial, and post-liberalization formation of middle class in India. We will elaborate on the idea of capacity to aspire, which is propounded by Appadurai, and we'll discuss how cultural practices help in class reproduction, self-cultivation, and self-presentation among middle class. And at the end, we'll discuss how urban aspirations of middle class are embedded in larger structural changes in economy, polity, and culture, and how it influences governance, urban structuring, and urban culture. Class and middle class. One may not find a detailed discussion about middle class in classical social theories. It is from the middle class of the 20th century that we start getting some discussion about middle class and their role in capitalist societies. Importantly, middle class did not form core subject for classical theorists, but certain ideas have definitely been found useful to understand middle class. Their role in capitalist society, lifestyle preferences, aspirations, desires, and taste. In particular, Marxian and Weberian ideas of class have contributed a lot in understanding middle class. Marx's idea of class is a postulation of class struggle. Unlike functionalist, class for Marx disintegrative quality of social structure, a determinant of unequal property relations, which divides people in categories of unequal rewards, accessibilities, and social position. Marx does not define class. He uses class in terms of possession of means of production and location of person in the system of production. For him, every society except primitive communism and future communism that he asked working class to establish after overthrowing capitalist society divides people in unequal positions of master and slave, landlord and serf, bourgeoisie and proletariat. In Marx's scheme, we find discussion about two polar groups who have conflicting interests. What we missed in his analytical framework is the absence of intermediate classes that are important category in capitalist societies. One may ask, what is the position of non-polar, that is the intermediate groups, in social structure, and what role do they play or perform in society? To some extent, economic basis of class constitution helps us in understanding domination of the ruling class, but it does not illustrate, apart from economic and political domination, how cultural domination of the ruling class or how ruling class ideologies are regulated or confirmed and internalized by the ruled as well as other classes. Deshpande notes, it is Antonio Gramsci who provides a careful and constructive analysis of the middle class and their role in modern capitalist societies. Gramsci's ideas of cultural hegemony is an important contribution towards understanding the role of middle class in capitalist societies. Moving beyond Marx's historical materialism, Gramsci draws attention towards production of cultural values and how it serves the end of the bourgeoisie. The ruling class creates values, ideas, institutions that are projected as natural, which ultimately serves social and economic positions of the ruling class. Max Weber, unlike Marx, also considers ownership of property an important criteria in determination of class, but he suggests that there are several other factors, such as market value of skill, that are significant in creating difference in economic return and thus sufficient in the formation of classes. He might not have elaborated the idea of middle class, but Weber's ideas of class, status group, and parties offer important clue to understand middle class formation and cultural values. Weber does not suggest inevitability of formation of antagonizing bipolar classes. Rather, in his scheme, we find elaborated class constitution, the propertied upper class, the propertyless white-collar workers or middle class, the petty bourgeoisies, and the manual working class. For Weber, a person's class situation is also his market situation, and members of the same class also share similar status situation. Pierre Bourdieu understands class
purely in terms of occupation and division of labor. Bourdieu confronts with Weber and argues that the subtle difference between class and status, which Weber considers as real, are rather nominal unities. In his book Distinction, Bourdieu argues that the difference between class and a status group is not only economic or material, but symbolic as well. Bourdieu maintains that status and thereby difference among different classes are simply manifestation of class difference. In Distinction, he develops two crucial ideas, habitus and field, that has been used extensively to understand differences among classes, class practices, and cultural capital. Bourdieu argues that habitus, which is akin to agency, and field, which is equivalent to structure, are dialectically related. While field for Bourdieu are institutions and rules that influence status, position, authority, and reward, habitus are cognitive structures that shape class condition and thereby shape the way people look at their belongingness to their class. The middle class occupies a curious location in capitalist societies. Of late, it has been recognized that middle class plays an important role in expansion and maintenance of capitalist ideologies. Scholars have elaborated the idea of middle class around the themes such as class antagonism, class consciousness, cultural capital, and hegemony. Consumer preferences and lifestyles, ideas of merit, and so on. However, the idea of class as a theoretical construct and analytical theme has suffered a setback since the early 1980s. In particular, class as a theoretical construct does not accommodate many of the middle class practices. Also, several other themes such as consumption, gender practices, nationalism were considered important to look at middle class practices. In the next section, we will discuss the trajectory of scholarship that developed around the middle class in India. Indian middle class, differences and continuations. As discussed earlier, class has, particularly in Marxian and Weberian writings, has been understood in economic terms. As mentioned by Weber and later elaborated by Gramsci and Bourdieu, culture forms an important dimension of middle class identity, self-imagination, self-description, and so on. Culture, when talked in this context, does not simply refer to rituals and beliefs, but also practices and orientations. Along this line, Appadurai's idea of capacity to aspire may allow us to discuss practices that shape middle-class identity, values, consumption, mobility, segregation, and distinction. Also, their imaginations of family, neighborhoods, city, nation, and the world. Appadurai uses capacity to aspire in order to draw attention towards poor and poverty, but it can be used to understand practices of self-cultivation and self-presentation among other classes. Appadurai also uses the concept of aspiration to point to the ideational character of many of the processes that affect city spaces and urban movement. We also often connect culture with the past, but the implication of one's values, morals, and beliefs are also future-oriented, which anthropologists have been ignoring for a long time. Therefore, Appadurai argues that capacity to aspire is a cultural capacity and oriented towards the future as well. However, the capacity to aspire, like any complex cultural capacity, thrives and survives on practice, repetition, exploration, conjectures, and refutation. The idea of aspiration also directs our attention towards other dimensions of class. For Gramsci, the middle class cultural practices are instrumental in deepening the ruling class hegemony, while Weber and Bourdieu, among other ideas, direct attention towards middle class practices and their attitude towards self-fashioning, self-cultivation, and self-presentation. In post-independent India, the middle class, due to its cultural practices, exposure, and imagination, along with the intelligentsia, politicians, bureaucrats, became harbinger of constructing a narrative of self-dependent India. Along with this, responsibility of the middle class also became a natural representative of the masses, who speak and represent the poor and the illiterate. The dominant ideologies were translated and transmitted through the channels of middle class practices, ideologies, and imaginations. Therefore, the post colonial middle class is located at the cross section of representing the masses as well as a self perpetuation. Since the colonial times in India, as we will discuss later in this section, the middle class has offered an ambivalent character. As discussed in independent India, the middle class took on a role to represent Indian masses. It became locus of social change and also became focus of state policies. On one hand, they construct new values and new morals, while on the other hand, they cling to the traditions that buttress inequalities, segregations, and deprivations. But in both cases, these practices are directed towards enlarging the sphere of greater control over institutions and people. They may appropriate visions of capitalist class and thus contribute it extending hegemony of the ruling class. But they may also confront ruling class ideas where there is a clash of interest or which restricts their ambit of authority or power. In such cases, they may even appropriate proletarian values. The middle class thus aspires to have the best of everything available in the world. In this short essay, we would touch upon a few important themes that have been incorporated in the analysis of middle class in India. It has now been established that there is a new middle class in India that is the product of policies of economic liberalization, quoted by Fernandez in 2004 and 6. And this class has often been compared with new rich as a social group that is the prime beneficiary of globalization in contemporary Asia. The new middle class is also differentiated from the old middle class that emerged during colonial period. And this new middle class sets the terms of reference of Indian society not only because of its development, but also because it is the darling of the official discourse and policymakers. The middle class in India emerged during colonial times, particularly with the introduction of English education and opening of opportunities in British administration. They were considered an important segment who would serve in British administration as well as help in modernizing India. Similar arguments could also be put forth for the emerging new middle class in contemporary India who are seen to serve the purposes of market economy and global capitalism. During the last couple of decades, scholarship around middle class has grown phenomenally, taking up issues of conspicuous consumption, social and cultural identity, social mobility, lifestyle preferences, taste, distinction, segregation practices, and ideas of merit and reservation. It has also been recognized that middle class in India, since the colonial times, does not form a homogeneous group, rather, it is differentiated around caste, region, language. Though middle class started growing during colonial times, there was hardly any full-length study conducted on the subject before. Vidya-mitra in 1961. However, in an interesting introduction, Mishra in 1983 writes, "The term middle class is frequently used, and since most of us, without the aid of specialists, understand what we mean, we use it in our everyday conversation." Mishra does not provide any precise definition, but he looks at features of middle class and broadly traces the growth of middle class, which, according to him, is largely a consequence of Western education and modern capitalist enterprise of improved communications and commercial progress, land reforms, and legal administration. Mishra argues that the middle class in India did not develop internally, rather, they were implanted in Indian society without developments in economy and social institutions. For him, the middle class were not the originators of new values, rather, imitators of English counterparts. He also argues that colonial middle class, mainly upper caste Hindu, did not take initiatives for mass education or economic development. Rather, they were more concerned with their own growth, remain engaged in consolidation of their position in administration and civil service. In contrast, Partha Chatterjee argues that middle class, that is Bhadraok, that means respectable folk in Calcutta, as elsewhere, played an instrumental role in creating the dominant forms of nationalist culture and social institutions in Bengal. Thus, since the colonial times, middle class has been seen as well as engaged in ambivalent practices of creating distinctions vis-a-vis creating new morals and values. In wake of the formation of Indian National Congress, which mainly had Western educated and Anglophone members, Lord Dufferin claimed middle class as a microscopic minority, did not represent voices of socially, economically, culturally and religiously divided population. The same may be true for the middle class who after independence began carving out structures that would create India a modern state suffused with traditional values. As Partha Chatterjee has also noted that there was a different type of orientation towards modernity and tradition among the middle classes. The difference between material as outer and spiritual as inner, which provided material for boosting the self in colonial times, was carried forward in post-independence era as well.
For the last couple of decades, more and more people have started recognizing themselves as belonging to middle class. The policies of economic liberalization have certainly created a band of people who now have disposable income owing to their employment in multinational companies, IT services, management firms, succinctly employed in service sector in India. So one coordinate that could be said to play a major role in portraying themselves as middle class is the distinction they create with upper class, and also with the distinction they place they create with the people who hardly own resources, both social and economic. So it is highly difficult to ascertain, especially in the post-liberalization period, middle class as a very, very coherent social category. If anything could be said confidently about this class, that this is a social marker, a way of describing one's social category and a social connotation. Dipankar Gupta argues to an extent and argues that there is no middle class in India. He compares and contrasts Indian middle class with their counterparts in the West and argues that political economic efforts to reduce inequality and gap between rich and the poor through social and economic policy was never taken into consideration in India. What is interesting to note that the new middle class in India remains a very heterogeneous category, and people from different caste, different religion, belonging to different region and linguistic category, they are divided not only in economic resources but also possess different set of values, different set of status, taste, lifestyles and consumption pattern. So if one wishes to delineate Indian middle class, there are at least two sets of middle class one can discern. One, the elite, English-speaking people traveling abroad, the class which eats in high-end restaurants, shopping, which shops in the malls, which drives automobiles and work in the service sector. Well, there is another category that has also developed alongside is non-elite category, which is ordinary, non-English speaking people. The people belonging to this category work as clerks, police officers, teachers, government, transport worker, and there are many more categories. So they may not purchase too many global products and may not eat in the high-end restaurants, but they would certainly be able to afford a television, a scooter or maybe a motorbike and a refrigerator, and they would send their children to a private English language schools even if not those of the best qualities. So this group definitely sees itself as middle class. However, it is being suggested that the restricted notion of middle class, comprising of people working at high clearance, may not tell the aspirations of a class. And that is also exposed to the processes of economic and cultural globalization. The idea of Aam Aadmi, common man, that remains in the air. This idea could be extended to include people from non-elite, ordinary and non-English speaking category to understand the contemporary nature of Indian society and social, economic and cultural changes. The era of liberalization and privatization has played an instrumental role in the transformation of society and transformation of various institutions in it. The choices available to these groups are different. Their options differ. Their lifestyles are not similar, but they are exposed to the processes of economic globalization and of cultural change, and that are spreading, especially through the media. So, moreover, both groups consider themselves and middle class, and even to an extent, modern.
The new forms of communication technologies made available by globalization appear to have brought about a transformation in almost all aspects of social life. The impact of the media and the flow of the new cultural elements have redesigned ways in which people live and imagine themselves living. The new middle class is transnational because it occupies a world which is constituted by the rapid flows of capital, technology, persons, and information across the globe. This new Indian middle class is also characterized by a considerable increase in consumption practices and aspirations for privileged lifestyles, strengthening and revigorating its social and class identity through conspicuous consumer culture, unseen in the country earlier. The economic as well as the cultural market has been expanding, and the alternatives of Western style international brands of clothes, accessories, and consumer products are available to the non elite middle class. Certainly, it triggers their consumption pattern. If there is a steep rise in income of people and that affects of the consumption patterns, then there is also a lot of innovations in the market that satisfied the consumption habit and inspiration of non-elite middle class and helps in securing upward social mobility and social status. Most of the times, academic renderings are highly occupied with the issues of social and political identity, consumption habits, and lifestyles of the middle class. There's the complete negligence of urban experiences of living, working, and survival in the globalizing market oriented society. And in contemporary writing also, we find such characterizations of middle class who are more concerned about their personal growths. As Fernandez and others have argued that the middle class supports beautification and gentrification programs of city administration and believes in the displacement of poor to the outskirts or peripheral areas. The poor for the middle class are considered threat to security and hygiene. The contemporary society in India sees living in a global city as a challenge. The increasing role of market and backtrack of welfare programs of the Indian government pose insecurities of living in a city, especially for the non-elite middle class. The worsening conditions of hospital, healthcare centers, and shrinking of government employment pose a threat to the middle class. Simultaneously, it is also being realized that to survive in a competitive market-led economic society, one needs to cover up oneself and create potential to excel. The threat of being displaced from the middle class and the aspirations to move on to other competition to secure more stable career and health issues such as streets strain of insecurity among the middle class. In a nutshell, the middle class in contemporary India is also involved in practices that strengthen their position in competitive urban environment.
So let's conclude what we have learned in this module. During colonial administration and later, the Indian state were the sites and agencies for the reproduction of middle class. Whereas after liberalization, it is the market and antecedent consumption of global products that take on the role for production of the new middle class. The middle class since colonial times has been a fragmented group, which was organized around primordial loyalties of caste, linguistic region, religion. Simultaneously, it is also oriented towards liberal secular ideas such as democratic government, voting rights. However, the internal differentiation within the middle class kept growing since the emergence of this class during the British rule in India. But at its inception, it was mainly upper caste Hindus and elite Muslims who formed middle class mainly due to their exposure to Western education, administrative positions, and professions such as law, medicines, journalism. After independence, the composition of middle class further diversified, and people from erstwhile marginalized communities such as scheduled caste and tribes, they also began joining this group. So this was partly due to affirmative actions propounded by the Indian state. The differentiation between colonial and post-colonial middle class, and further the division within the post-colonial middle class, remained pronounced, even though they supposed to compose somewhat uniform category. So as said in the beginning, the middle class in India has played a crucial role in defining the character of Indian nationalism and domestic practices. One of the most pivotal contribution of the middle class throughout its history has been invention of leadership, not only political but also social. The old aristocratic and landed class were either displaced by the middle class, or the traditional leadership had to reinvent itself as middle class to stay in the positions of influence. Towards the end, it needs to be recognized that the middle class remain a contested sociological issue, and scholars have been trying to figure out size, composition, scope, aspirations, hope, desires, politics, consumption patterns of the middle class. So on one hand, it is internally fragmented and divided along primordial identities, while on the other, they display common features and they engage in discursive practices that enhances greater control over people and resources. Economic estimation is an important criteria to understand the middle class, but cultural practices and cultural politics of middle class offer interesting vantage point to understand social structure, political economy of the state, and a larger social relationship among different sections of population. Thank you.